Welcome back to episode 39 of More Than Words, the show that's just discovered 9 months in and 3/4 of the way through that it forgot to include the lowest point in Britain. In my defence, it's very easy to overlook, it being below sea level and all. This week, the only place in England where the original medieval street plan is still intact, because everyone since has apparently been too polite to suggest anything different. A devil's wing preserved in a Norfolk church because a different congregation decided Satan was a bit much for the windows, and drunk pallbearers who dropped a coffin fell off a bridge and drowned. A sequence of events now apparently available for replay on Most Haunted. Expect a spectral dog that once crashed 2 church services in the same storm, a Brazilian racing driver living quietly in a Norwich bungalow while his neighbours had absolutely no idea, and a planning dispute about horse cremation that managed to cause more local outrage than a ruined medieval church and a deserted village combined. Think papal correspondence addressed to a hamlet meets Ayrton Senna doing laps of a Norfolk airfield. Narrated by someone who just hit the 75% milestone, immediately injured a shoulder by sleeping, then injured a hip by testing new trainers, and is now running a physiotherapy waiting list inside his own body with a growing backlog and no clear discharge date. This is episode 39. The Root of the Matter. Time as usual for the numerical update first. The total distance covered so far is 2,164.5 kilometres, which is 75.26% of my revised route of 2,876 kilometres. More on this navigational oversight shortly, but either way, we're now officially through the 3/4 mark without any dodgy rounding. The time taken in real life to cover the 55.5 kilometres needed to complete this stage was the 23rd to the 28th of March 2026. My current position is 3 days ahead of schedule, back up from 1.5. The buffer has politely restored itself, the way British things do when they'd rather not cause a scene. 1/4 remaining, home fen is on the map. Onward. IRL. Shoulder season. A milestone worth acknowledging before we get to the injuries. And there are injuries, there are always injuries. At this point, this is basically a medical travelogue with occasional references to Norfolk churches. But stage 39 took us through the 75% mark, 3/4 done, 1/4 remaining. The spreadsheet, for a brief and uncharacteristic moment, appeared to be experiencing something in the vicinity of satisfaction. It didn't last, obviously, but it was there. A flicker, like watching a cat attempt empathy. There is, as it happens, a genuine psychological phenomenon that explains this feeling. And since I've recently acquired the kind of retirement-adjacent relationship with popular psychology that means I now read these things instead of PowerPoint decks about next quarter's imaginary sales forecast, I can tell you it's called the goal gradient effect. Originally proposed by behaviourist Clark Hull in 1932, a man who spent a meaningful portion of his career watching rodents run mazes and concluding, with admirable seriousness, that they sped up near the food reward. The principle holds that motivation intensifies as you approach a goal. The closer you get, the faster you go. Dopamine perks up, effort increases, the finish line becomes magnetic. Hull tested this on rats. Researchers in 2006 tested it on humans via coffee loyalty cards and found, reassuringly, that we also accelerate our behaviour the closer we get to the stamp that gives us a free flat white. We are, in motivational terms, rats with better footwear and more complicated spreadsheets, but the underlying circuitry is the same. See finish line, speed up. The wrinkle, and there's always a wrinkle, is what researchers call the post-reward reset. The motivational dip that occurs immediately after hitting a milestone before the next one snaps into focus. The effort that was surging towards 75% will briefly fall into a psychological pothole. Only after that does the gradient kick in again towards 100%. So technically, having just hit 75, I should now be operating at peak efficiency. Laser focused, relentless, the rat's sprinting for the cheese. But there's a dip approaching, and I need to remember that before I start congratulating myself and immediately tripping over my own psychology. What the rats did not have to contend with, as far as the published research indicates, was a left shoulder that had apparently decided, overnight and without consultation, that sideways movement was no longer within its service offering. Yes, day one of this stage began with me waking up to discover that my left arm had opted out. No warning, no build-up, just a quiet overnight resignation from anything involving lifting, reaching, or generally behaving like an arm. It's a humbling moment when your own limb refuses to cooperate and you can't even blame sport, overexertion, or a heroic incident. Just sleep. 8 hours of lying down, and somehow I've come out of it less functional than when I went in. I have no idea what caused it. There was no dramatic incident. No reach for something on a high shelf, no twist, no pop, no single identifiable moment of regret. I simply slept, and my shoulder responded to this by staging a work to rule that lasted 4 days. The body's capacity to generate new complaints from nothing, no trigger, no warning, no sporting mishap, is, at this stage of life, genuinely impressive. You go to bed fine, you get up injured. The intervening hours, spent unconscious, are apparently enough. Naturally, this scuppered golf for the day, unless I was planning to unveil a revolutionary one-handed playing style, which I'm fairly confident the wider golfing community is not yet ready for. Walking remained viable, provided I didn't ask the left arm to do anything ambitious. One of those sessions took place on the treadmill, as the weather decided to remind us all that winter hadn't quite finished with us yet. It was during this session that I debuted a new pair of trainers, the previous ones having finally given up after 9 months of loyal service and what must be described as sustained abuse. The new pair arrived with excellent reviews, particularly regarding cushioning, and I decided, in a decision I am now prepared to classify as optimistic, bordering on stupid, that the best way to test cushioning quality was to introduce some interval runs. Not long or serious ones, just enough to make the shoes do the thing cushioning is supposed to do, a bounce test if you will. And to be fair, the trainers passed. They're cushioned, responsive, and frankly far more athletic than I am. Unfortunately, the same cannot be said for my right hip, which responded to this experiment by lodging an immediate and formal protest. The shoes bounced enthusiastically. The hip absorbed this information and the bouncing and said, absolutely not. This is now a project that's generated a mystery leg cramp, a spin bike glute incident, a shoulder that took offence at a night's sleep, and a hip that objected to a bounce test. The injury portfolio continues to diversify. I'm essentially running a physiotherapy waiting room in my own body, and the waiting list keeps growing. The shoulder improved, as these things tend to do, and this is where the gold gradient effect does actually start to make sense. There does feel like a psychological shift having passed that 75% mark. By Thursday, it had recovered sufficiently for golf, a development the spreadsheet greeted with the enthusiasm of something that's been watching mileage accumulate via pavements and treadmills only, and was ready for a 9-kilometre fairway bonus. A couple of decent walks over the final days brought stage 39 to its conclusion without any fresh incidents, which at this point counts as an achievement in its own right. So here we are, 75% down, 25% to go, which on paper sounds like the easy bit, the downhill stretch, the victory lap. But if this week has taught me anything, it's that the biggest obstacle between here and the finish line is no longer distance, weather, or even motivation. It's the very real possibility that I might go to bed perfectly healthy and wake up having somehow injured my left ear, right ankle, and possibly a finger I didn't even know I had. Still, the end is in sight, assuming I can make it there without straining a hammy while putting the kettle on. Virtual Insanity Stage 39. Hedenham to Roudham. Before we resume from Ellingham, a confession. I've made a discovery, a humbling one. A discovery that calls into question my competence, my planning, and possibly my ability to read a map without adult supervision. Cast your mind back to the beginning of this project. The premise was simple: trace a route connecting the geographic extremities of the UK, the compass points, the highest and lowest elevations, the iconic endpoints, the whole cartographic greatest hits album, using a rather excellent online tool called Plotter Route, which does the clever routing business once you've fed it the waypoints and told it firmly that motorways are not the point. You feed it the coordinates, it connects the dots, you end up with a 2,884 kilometre odyssey through the back roads of Britain. Elegant. Foolproof. Except, and this is the crucial bit, you do actually have to remember to include all the points. I forgot Home Fen. This is, in fairness, quite an achievement, because it's not easy to overlook the bit of the country that's below sea level. That's like forgetting the basement exists while wondering why everything smells faintly of damp. It's the geographical equivalent of losing your car keys and later discovering you've been sitting on them for 9 months. I genuinely thought I'd included it. But that was 39 weeks ago, and frankly I'm lucky if I can remember what I had for breakfast yesterday, let alone whether I ticked the lowest point in Britain box while plotting a 3,000 kilometre national ramble sometime last year. Fortunately, having stumbled across this error at this juncture, it can be repaired. And in a twist that feels like the universe patting me gently on the head, rerouting from Kirby Kane via Home Fen and back towards Cornwall produces a route that's actually 8 kilometres shorter than the original. 5 whole miles shorter. My navigational incompetence has, against all probability, given me something back. Every cloud and all that. The less good news is that this correction has consequences for the villages involved. A number of English settlements that were previously on the route are being quietly removed from this narrative without warning, explanation, or the opportunity to prepare a decent local interest story. To them, sincere apologies. You were on the list, geography intervened. Think of it as being voted off a very niche reality show. An equal and opposite number of villages have been thrust, without prior notice, into the spotlight, subjected to bad puns, dubious jokes, and the general indignity of featuring in this increasingly sprawling podcast. To them, also apologies of a somewhat different kind. The route continues, Home Fen will get its moment, and the lowest point in Britain, after 39 weeks of being overlooked, is finally on the map. On we go then. Mapped out. Ellingham should have been the starting point for this stage. A perfectly respectable Norfolk village with a church, a 12th century mill, and the sort of quiet river edge scenery that looks like it was designed by Visit Britain during a particularly sentimental week. It even has Ellingham Hall, a Georgian pile now used as a wedding venue, which previously served between 2010 and 2012 as the house arrest location for Julian Assange while he fought extradition from the comfort of a country estate in Norfolk. Which is either a very British resolution to a global diplomatic crisis or proof that even international fugitives from justice appreciate a decent rural setting. In short, Ellingham had history, charm and enough architectural credibility, not to mention one of the most unexpected footnotes in the WikiLeaks saga, to make us look like we'd planned this whole thing with competence and intention. Instead, thanks to my navigational abilities, which continue to operate at the level of a malfunctioning Etch-a-Sketch, Ellingham becomes the first place we're ghosting. Not politely skipping, not gently bypassing. Ghosting. I feel like I should send it a card, or at least a note saying, it's not you, it's me, well it's the map, but mostly me. A shame really, Ellingham deserved better than being collateral damage in my spiralling map-based incompetence. Ah well, never mind, onward we must stumble. Holy cow. Starting our amended route, Hedenham is one of those Norfolk villages that looks, at first glance, like it should be quietly minding its own business. A couple of lanes, a church, some fields, the usual rural choreography. And then you scratch the surface and discover it's been busy. Not recently, obviously, but historically, absolutely heaving. Its name means Hedenham's enclosure, a Saxon whose identity has been so comprehensively lost to history that even the Domesday Book doesn't bother elaborating. By 1086, Hedenham appears as a 34-household settlement in the hundred of Loddon, owned by Hugh de Branches, Earl of Chester. A Norman magnate whose land holdings were so vast, he appears to have been playing medieval Monopoly while holding every property, every house, and the entire bank. And then there are the Romans. Of course there are Romans. They were everywhere along this stretch of the Waveney, apparently operating some kind of industrial pottery franchise. Hedenham's contribution was a Roman pottery kiln discovered in 1858, later repurposed as a lime kiln before collapsing, plus 5 cremation urns found nearby almost a century later, because nothing says quiet Norfolk village like a surprise Roman crematorium. The Church of St. Peter, a Grade 1 listed 14th century structure, is where Hedenham really starts showing off. In 1247, Pope Innocent IV issued a papal bull in response to a complaint from the Bishop of Norwich. This is not, disappointingly, a holy cow, but a formal letter sealed with lead, the medieval equivalent of receiving an email marked High Importance from the Vatican. About what, the surviving records refuse to say, but the original document still exists, meaning this tiny parish once generated enough ecclesiastical drama to get the Pope's attention in an era when communication involved quills, wax, and a courier who might be eaten by wolves. Inside the church, the octagonal font has been baptising Hedenham children for roughly 6 centuries, while the gargoyles on the tower stare down the Norfolk weather with the wearied disbelief of beings who've spent 600 years wondering if the sun died in the 14th century. The village also has Hedenham Hall, a mellow brick Tudor house built around 1590. One of those Norfolk residences that looks like it should be hosting a BBC period drama in which someone spends 6 episodes staring meaningfully out of an upper floor window. And just when you think Hedenham has exhausted its supply of historical curveballs, White's 1845 directory casually mentions that the Mermaid Inn once presided over 3 acres, highly celebrated for supplying the most valuable varieties. Of what, it declines to specify. Vegetables, herbs, contraband? Norfolk's 19th century horticultural underworld remains tragically undocumented. In short, Hedenham is one of those villages that looks like it should barely have a paragraph, and then suddenly you're knee-deep in Romans, Tudors, papal correspondence and agricultural mysteries. It's always the quiet ones. A wing and a prayer. Woodton is a village 5 miles northwest of Bungay, whose name comes from the Old English meaning settlement in the woods. A description that made perfect sense in the Bronze Age, when ring ditches dated between 2350 and 701 BC were being enthusiastically dug, and is still broadly accurate today. Like a village that simply refused software updates and is now running on whatever prehistoric firmware it woke up with. From the 16th century, the village was a long-running Suckling family franchise. The Sucklings were everywhere in this corner of Norfolk. Rectors, MPs, landowners, the sort of dynasty that accumulates influence the way other families accumulate mismatched Tupperware lids. Their most famous contribution, naturally, is the one they share with every other settlement within 20 miles of Burnham Thorpe, a connection to Horatio Nelson. Catherine Suckling, Nelson's mother, was from Woodton. Her father, the Reverend Maurice Suckling, was rector here, and the young Nelson is said to have played in the grounds of Woodton Hall, climbing a cedar tree that still stands and is now known, with the understated confidence of a village that knows exactly what it's got, as Nelson's Tree. The hall itself was demolished in 1842, a move that must have made sense at the time, but now feels like Norfolk accidentally uninstalling one of its better features. The Church of All Saints is a round tower church, Norfolk's favourite architectural flex, and contains one of the more unusual acquisitions in the county's ecclesiastical history. In the 1830s, a church in Kent commissioned a stained glass window featuring, among other things, the devil. When that church restored its windows in 1932, the congregation decided the devil was a bit much. The rector of Woodton, presumably a man with a broader sense of humour or a very specific interior design vision, bought the window. It didn't fit, so the devil was excised like an unwanted plotline. What's left, a single olive green wing under the right hand of Christ, is still there. A reminder that even in Norfolk, Satan can't get planning permission. The 100 Games. Woodton's landscape extends into Road Green, sitting on the edge of the old parish, in the interior of South Norfolk. Wide fields, big skies, hedgerows doing their best to look vertical. Both once sat inside the Loddon 100, a medieval administrative unit that grouped parishes together in the same way a toddler groups crayons, vaguely, confidently, and with no discernible system. 100 was, in theory, an area containing 100 hides, a hide being the amount of land supposedly needed to support a household, or, more realistically, the amount of land the medieval state felt it could tax without someone setting fire to a barn. In practice, the size of 100 varied so wildly it felt less like a system and more like a medieval administrator eyeballed a map, muttered, "Yeah, that'll do," and went to lunch. Deepwade 100, the one Road Green sits on the edge of, was one such unit. A 10 by 6 mile slab of South Norfolk that grouped parishes together for taxation, justice and whatever else medieval governance involved, which appears to have been mostly mud, walking and the occasional argument about boundaries. It took its name from a ford on the River Tass, because medieval Norfolk had a habit of pointing at a perfectly ordinary geographical feature and declaring it the beating heart of local administration. So when you stand in Road Green, you're not just in a hamlet by a road on a green. You're standing on the ghost of a medieval organisational scheme that once decided who paid what, who answered to whom, and where the nearest ford was, because in the 11th century that was considered cutting-edge civic infrastructure. Today it's just another quiet corner of Norfolk, but beneath your feet lies the faint outline of a bureaucracy so rudimentary it makes a parish council WhatsApp group look like the Pentagon. Dog days are over. Hopefully. Hempnall is one of those South Norfolk villages that looks at first glance like background scenery and then quietly produces a full CV. It sits about 8 miles south of Norwich in what was once Deepwade Hundred and is now the district of South Norfolk, with a present day population a little over 1200 and a parish that spreads itself across the headwaters of the River Tass. The name comes from the Old English Hemmer's Halch, Hemmer's nook of land, which sounds like a minor fancy spin-off nobody asked for, but is in fact a perfectly standard Anglo-Saxon property label. It appears in Doomsday as a settlement of 57 households, already punching above its weight, the 11th century equivalent of a place with its own Tesco Express. The wider parish has produced everything from prehistoric finds to Roman material to medieval earthworks, and once hosted a weekly market and biannual fairs. On the 4th of September 1759, John Wesley walked 9 miles from Norwich to preach in Hempnall's marketplace. In his journal, he notes being followed by a hostile crowd, possibly encouraged by Norwich's brewers, who were not, on balance, thrilled about Methodism's potential impact on beer sales. Their ringleader attempted to sabotage the sermon with a horn, until someone in the audience removed it, at which point the rest became deeply attentive. Whether this was a sudden outbreak of spiritual conviction, or simply the behavioural effect of confiscating the only available brass instrument, is not recorded. It's amazing how quickly a mob calms down once you take away its kazoo. And if Wesley's mob was the noisiest thing to trouble Hempnall that year, the village soon found other ways to keep its reputation lively, namely its centuries-old acquaintance with the county's most famous phantom hound. Hempnall sits squarely within the territory of Black Shuck, the spectral black dog of East Anglian folklore, whose career has comfortably outlived most of the institutions that first recorded him. Descriptions vary, but the standard specification is a large, shaggy, often red-eyed dog that appears on lonely roads or in the places you'd rather not linger, sometimes as an omen of death, sometimes as a passing scent of dread on four paws. The legend's high point came in 1577, when Black Shuck crashed services in Bungay and Blytheborough, tearing through two churches in the middle of a storm and leaving scorch marks, splintered wood, and several parishioners who suddenly had a much more personal relationship with eternity. Then he vanished, leaving the rest of the village to sweep up and pretend this was all perfectly normal. His Hempnall appearances are far quieter, a brief sighting on a dark road, like he's just checking the perimeter before clocking off. Personally, I wouldn't be walking home from the pub. Not unless I fancied starring in a low-budget folk horror remake of Marley and Me. Solar flare. A few miles away, Long Stratton demonstrates what happens when you build a settlement directly on a Roman road and then forget to move it for the next 2,000 years. Its name literally means farm or settlement on a Roman road, and the road in question is now the A140. Once a proud artery of empire, now a conveyor belt of caravans, arctics, and people who've catastrophically misjudged how long it takes to get to Norwich. The town sits almost exactly halfway between Norwich and Diss, a neat geographical accident that has shaped its life for 2 millennia. Everything came to it in the medieval period, everything blasts straight past it now. Long Stratton's recent history reads like a running feud between the weather and the highways department. On the 23rd of November 1981, it was hit by a tornado during a major national outbreak. And in December 1989, another, stronger tornado ploughed through the town, damaging around 100 buildings over several kilometres. Proof that British tornadoes do exist, they just treat Long Stratton as their personal Airbnb, dropping in, rearranging the furniture, and leaving everyone else pretending this is normal for Norfolk. Meanwhile, the A140 continued to slice straight through the centre, and the bypass took a full century to sort out. Long enough for archaeologists to start treating the planning paperwork as its own distinct historical period. Probably late bureaucratic. Long Stratton has stopped being surprised by any of this, it just nods wearily and carries on. In late 2024, Norfolk discovered it was the proposed host of 17,000 acres of solar farms. The sort of number that makes you check whether someone's accidentally leaned on the keyboard. Two of the biggest schemes sit right here. The East Pye project, roughly 2,700 acres around Hempnall, and another 2,500 acre site near Long Stratton. These are not solar farms so much as solar continents. The kind of thing you could see from space, or at least from the top of Nelson's tree if you squint. Local leaders have expressed concerns about the loss of agricultural land and the impact on food security, which is understandable when your parish is being asked to choose between growing wheat and becoming a giant rechargeable battery. National policy, meanwhile, is very keen on decarbonisation, which is also understandable because the planet is on fire. The result is a sort of polite Norfolk standoff. One side saying, we do need clean energy, the other saying, yes, but perhaps not all of it in Long Stratton. And the government quietly insisting that someone somewhere is going to have to host the national extension cable. If the projects go ahead, the area will become one of the most solar-dense regions in the country. This is not necessarily a bad thing. It's just that nobody expected Hempnall to become the East Anglian answer to the Mojave Desert. The villages will still have their lanes, churches, archaeological layers and its occasional spectral dog. They'll simply also have enough photovoltaic capacity to power a small fleet of starships. Fully charged. The phone sets sound like the neighbours on your cul-de-sac everyone politely waves to but secretly resents because they still haven't joined the next door group and leave their bins out for approximately 3 geological eras. In reality, Fawnset St Mary and Fawnset St Peter are two parishes sharing a name, a boundary and the slightly baffled expression of places that were once one thing and then, in the 15th century, got told they were now two separate administrative entities and should learn to live with it. They started life as a single Doomsday entry of 21 households, which is the medieval equivalent of small but doing fine, and then spent the next millennium specialising in quiet continuity with the occasional plot twist, like the Fawnset Hoard, a stash of late Iron Age and Roman coins buried under the fields and rediscovered in 1996, proving only that somebody once had money and then very much didn't. The Iron Age version of forgetting your pin. St Peter gets the architectural close-up. Its round tower, East Anglia's idea of a Thomas Telford calling card if Telford had been really into flint cylinders, dates to around 1000 AD. And is one of those Anglo-Saxon statements that manages to be both modest and a bit of a show-off. It's basically a stone column saying, oh, this old thing, while quietly flexing double bell openings, stone shafts, and carved capitals that are unmistakably pre-conquest if you're the sort of person who notices that sort of thing, and politely impressive even if you're not. Inside, the 1485 Drake tomb has Thomas and Elizabeth Drake lying side by side in medieval dress, hands together, frozen in the act of being permanently respectable. The original inscription asks passers-by to say the Lord's Prayer for Thomas's soul. It's now defaced, which feels like the church-going equivalent of unsubscribing from a mailing list. Dorothy Wordsworth did a full Norfolk residency here. 6 years at Fawn at St Peter's Rectory from 1788 to 1794, ages 16 to 22, while her uncle was in charge of the parish. William, meanwhile, was off doing the full romantic hero gap year package. Cambridge, France, falling in love, watching a revolution, and gathering material for The Prelude, his autobiographical epic and arguably his best work outside Cloud and Daffodil bothering. Dorothy, by contrast, was in South Norfolk running a household, walking the flat lanes, and quietly levelling up the observational superpowers that would make her journal some of the finest nature writing in English. The Fawnsets don't make the romantic highlight reel, the glossy, poster-worthy bits of the movement, but they were part of the long, quiet boot-up sequence. The years where nothing seems to happen, and then decades later you realise the landscape has been quietly rewiring your brain. St Mary, not to be outdone, goes for a different kind of literary footnote. From 1846 to 1853, its rector was John William Colenso, a mathematician turned clergyman who would later become the first Bishop of Natal in what's now South Africa. Once there, he wrote a commentary on the first 5 books of the Bible, pointing out that some bits didn't quite add up. Noah's Ark and the Red Sea crossing being eyebrow-raising examples. A level of honesty the church received with all the warmth of a wasp in the vestry. He was tried for heresy, convicted, deposed, reinstated, and spent the rest of his career in a permanent theological knife fight, writing maths textbooks in Zulu and consistently arguing for Zulu political rights. By comparison, his years in Fawncett St Mary look like the quiet establishing shot before the plot kicks off. Today the Fawncetts are still doing their favourite trick, looking tranquil while quietly starring in a subplot nobody warned them about. St Peter's has just landed a national lottery grant big enough to haul it off the Heritage at Risk register and reinvent the churchyard as a nature and heritage hub. While down the road, a newly approved 120 megawatt battery site is preparing to hum away like a sci-fi prop the parish council didn't order and the locals insist will terrify kestrels. In other words, another perfectly normal week in a pair of villages that specialise in looking serene while absolutely everything just happens out of shot. Grid and bear it. Just to the west, and still in the Fawncett parish orbit, Hargate is one of those Norfolk micro-settlements that seems to exist mainly to test whether your sat-nav has a sense of humour. It lurks on the back roads, in that zone where the parish stops pretending to be a sequence of villages and instead becomes a scatterplot of houses, hedges and people who absolutely know which tractor belongs to whom and what it did last summer. The name itself is older than anything with plumbing. Har from Old English for boundary or grey. Gate from the Old Norse for road or gap, giving you something like Old Grey Road or the road at the boundary, which, in South Norfolk, is basically the entire design brief for a place. The Danish settlers who arrived in East Anglia from the 9th century onward brought their vocabulary and a firm belief in calling things exactly what they look like, even if what they looked like was road but slightly different. Hargate is one of those hybrid names where Old English and Old Norse sit together with the weary diplomacy of neighbours who've been sharing a fence for so long they've forgotten who started the argument. It's the kind of coexistence academics politely call Anglo-Scandinavian contact, and everyone else would recognise as two naming traditions, deciding the landscape was already confusing enough without escalating matters. Further along the B1113, New Buckingham is a sort of place that looks like it was designed by a medieval town planner who really loved straight lines, and then, miraculously, everyone who lived there afterwards agreed not to mess it up. It's the only village in England to retain its original medieval street layout, a planned Norman town laid out between 1146 and 1176, still sitting neatly inside the grid its founders drew up almost 9 centuries ago. The earthwork and ditch that once enclosed it are still visible, like the town is quietly bracing for the return of the 12th century and wants to be ready just in case. The whole saga begins with William d'Albini, a Norman baron who in 1145 decided his existing castle at Old Buckingham was beneath him and handed it to the Augustinian canons on the condition they knock the defences down. The medieval equivalent of donating your old house to charity but insisting they bulldoze the porch and the garden shed first. He then built himself a new fortress just to the west, a circular keep, the earliest known in England, with 11-foot thick walls surrounded by an almost perfectly circular moat and 2 baileys. It's the architectural equivalent of saying, yes, I could build a square tower like everyone else, but have you considered a round? To service this new castle, d'Albini laid out a town on a tidy grid, complete with a central marketplace, the Market Cross. A Grade 2 style listed structure with a whipping post, because medieval urban design always included a light sprinkling of corporal punishment. And it still stands on the green today. The whole village is now a conservation area, which is a polite way of saying, please don't ruin this, it's been doing its best since the 1100s. It'll come back to haunt you. Eccles is one of those Norfolk places that feels less like a village and more like a quiet historical subplot that wandered off from the main narrative and set up home between Snetterton and Quidenham. It's since been administratively absorbed into Quidenham's parish, which is possibly a shame for Eccles, but excellent for us, because Quidenham brings baggage. Specifically, Viking's Mound, a large earthwork on the west side of Eccles Road that has spent the last 2 centuries being accused of being absolutely everything except what it actually is. Local tradition has insisted at various points that the mound is a Bronze Age barrow, a Viking monument, a battlefield site, and, inevitably, the burial place of Boudica, because in East Anglia she is apparently buried everywhere except her actual grave. If you dig a hole in Norfolk deep enough to lose a spade, someone will appear behind you and say, "Ah yes, Boudica lived here." The truth, and it is a truth delivered with the weary patience of archaeologists who've had to say this out loud far too many times, is that the mound is almost certainly a small 12th century Norman motte, built by the Dalbinis to guard a ford on the River Whittle. Given the mound is from the 1100s, the only way Boudica could be buried in it is if she waited roughly 1,100 years for the Normans to arrive with a shovel. She didn't. She absolutely didn't. Quidenham, never one to let facts get in the way of a good story, still puts Boudica on its village sign, riding her chariot like she's late for an appointment with the Roman Empire. The sign exists because the rumour persists that she lived nearby and was buried in the mound. A rumour that has been disproven, reproven, disproven again, and now exists in a state of folkloric quantum uncertainty. At this point, Boudica isn't a historical figure, she's a regional franchise with multiple branches and a loyalty scheme. And Quidenham doesn't stop there with the folklore. Oh no, it escalates. Quidenham Hall contributes a tale in which the pallbearers of Lord Albemarle got so catastrophically drunk they dropped the coffin, fell off a bridge and drowned. A sequence of events that sounds less like a cortege and more like an 18th century health and safety training video titled Funeral Handling, Common Errors and How to Avoid Them. The incident is said to replay on certain nights, presumably when the ghosts have checked their rota and confirmed they're on shift. And if that wasn't enough, the same road also boasts a headless coachman driving a coffin-laden carriage, because apparently the supernatural in this parish operates on a strict more is more policy. At this point, Norfolk folklore isn't whispering eerie tales by candlelight, it's staging a full American Horror Story season on a B-road, complete with bonus content and deleted scenes. Eccles itself, meanwhile, just sits there, quietly, politely, like a village trying not to draw attention to the fact that everything around it behaves like a county-wide audition for Most Haunted. It's a place where archaeology, legend and monastic calm all coexist. Not harmoniously exactly, but with the polite tolerance of neighbours who've agreed not to mention it as long as nobody leaves ectoplasm in the hallway again. A runway success. Turning left onto the A11, we accelerate up to Snetterton Circuit, which is named after the nearby village of Snetterton, even though most of the track actually sits inside Quidenham parish. A decision that feels both geographically accurate and slightly petty. Snetterton gets the glory, Quidenham gets the noise, the traffic, and the occasional vehicle enthusiastically exploring the concept of unintended flight. The whole place follows a pattern that's become almost comforting across Norfolk: a wartime airfield, an American bomber group, and the post-war question of what to do with several miles of perfectly good concrete. RAF Snetterton Heath opened in 1943 and became home to the 96th Bomb Group of the US Air Force, who stayed longer here than at most bases and flew B-17s until the end of the war. They lost more than 900 aircrew and 250 aircraft, a statistic that hangs over the landscape with a kind of solemnity you don't usually associate with a place now famous for track day exhaust fumes and people arguing about tyre compounds. After the Americans left in December 1945, the RAF lingered until 1948, at which point the airfield was declared surplus and handed back to its owner, Fred Riches, who'd given them farmland and received something that looked like a county-sized patio. Riches could have done the usual Norfolk thing: sheep, barley, tractors. But instead, he agreed to let the Aston Martin Owners Club race on the runways in 1951. On the strict condition that nothing interfered with Sunday church services, because the last thing anyone wanted was a vicar delivering a sermon over the sound of a DB2 attempting low Earth orbit. The first event took place on 27th of October 1951, and Motorsport magazine declared it an excellent event over an interesting new course, which is 1950s journalism for nobody died and the sandwiches were acceptable. From there, Snetterton spent the next 70 years becoming one of the great British circuits. A flat, open expanse where spectators can see almost the entire track and drivers can see almost nothing except the next braking point arriving at 140 miles per hour. Jim Clark, Graham Hill and Jack Brabham all raced here in non-championship Formula 1 events in the 1960s, because apparently the best way to prepare for Monaco was to spend a weekend in Norfolk trying not to hit a hay bale. And then there's Ayrton Senna, who lived in Norwich in the early 1980s while racing for Van Diemen in Formula Ford and used Snetterton as his home circuit. Imagine being a Norfolk local in 1982 and discovering that the quiet Brazilian lad renting a house down the road is about to become arguably the greatest driver in the history of the sport. Today, the Senna Straight connects to Hamilton, and 2 corners down is Wilson, named for Justin Wilson, who died in 2015. The corner names at Snetterton form a kind of motorsport family tree, part tribute, part celebration, the sport's way of honouring its past while reminding you that the present is still very much alive and lapping. Walk this way. Larling, on the A11 between Attleborough and Thetford, is one of those Norfolk villages that feels like it's been quietly minding its own business since approximately the late Bronze Age and sees no reason to stop now. Beyond the usual East Anglian Domesday and Church history starter pack, it once had a wartime emergency runway on Larling Heath and has a pub that's been knocking around for 4 centuries, presumably because Larling approaches change with the same enthusiasm glaciers have for sprinting. The Angel was a coaching inn on the old Norwich to London road, and its interior reads like a time capsule curated by someone with a deep respect for wood panelling and a pathological distrust of refurbishment. The 1930s barback, the brick fireplaces, the fixed seating that hasn't shifted since the era when moving furniture required a parish meeting, all still there. It won CAMRA's West Norfolk Pub of the Year in both 2023 and 2024, which suggests that the formula of don't change anything unless it's on fire continues to work. Larling today is a perfectly pleasant place to live, provided you never attempt to drive anywhere near it, because the A11 in this stretch behaves less like a major trunk road and more like a recurring hazard perception test. In October 2024, the southbound carriageway was closed after a cooking oil spill turned several miles of tarmac into Norfolk's attempt at the world's largest roadside stir-fry. Highways teams spent hours trying to degrease the road, presumably resisting the urge to season it. This followed the now routine parade of car and tractor collisions, because nothing says Breckland morning like a massive Ferguson and a hatchback attempting to occupy the same coordinates. Meanwhile, back in the village itself, someone is currently rebuilding their home as an American-style ranch, complete with the kind of wide-open aesthetic that suggests they watched Yellowstone once and thought, yes, that, but in East Anglia. It's a bold move, a Norfolk prairie fantasy rising from the ashes of a house fire, and it leaves Larling with a pleasingly odd combination of a 1631 coaching inn and a house that looks ready to host a cattle drive. Pet Project. Roudham is where this stage ends, and it ends on a note of quiet, slightly uncanny Breckland minimalism, a parish that technically exists, but only just. Its defining landmark is St Andrew's, a medieval church that burned down in 1736 when workmen accidentally set fire to the thatched roof and has been left on pause ever since. The tower still stands, the walls still rise, and the whole structure has spent nearly 3 centuries looking like it's waiting for someone to press resume. Conservation groups periodically debate what to do with it, stabilise it, restore it, or simply admit that it's reached a point where restoration would only spoil the mood. Beside it lie the earthworks of the deserted medieval village of Roudham, abandoned after the population collapsed in the 14th and 15th centuries and never really recovered. It gives the place the unusual atmosphere of a settlement where the ruins carried on long after the residents clocked off, like a medieval screensaver that no one ever bothered to switch off. Roudham Heath stretches out beyond the church, a nature reserve of sandy Breckland soil, rabbit warrens and rare species, and also one of the most flammable landscapes in Norfolk. It's seen multiple wildfires over the years, the kind that shut roads, fill the air with smoke, and make the heath look like it's auditioning for a public information film about climate change. And because no Breckland parish is complete without a planning dispute, Roudham recently found itself in the news over a proposal for a pet and horse crematorium, which prompted what the Eastern Daily Press called locals' fury. It turns out nothing unites a sparsely populated parish faster than the prospect of becoming the region's premier destination for horse cremation. Roudham already has a ruined church, a vanished village, and a heath that keeps catching fire. The last thing it needs is a facility that makes the place look like the opening chapter of a Stephen King novel. Stage 39 threaded us through the quieter interior of South Norfolk and the Breckland fringe, gathering up the sort of material that would make most counties call the police. We get papal correspondence addressed to a hamlet, Wesley pursued by what may have been a brewery-funded mob, a market town hit by tornadoes twice and waiting a century for a bypass, Ayrton Senna in a Norwich bungalow using Snetterton as his personal practice ground, drunk pallbearers drowning at a bridge, a spectral dog, a ruined church, a vanished village, a heath that keeps catching fire, and a planning dispute about horse cremation that somehow manages to top everything preceding it. From here, the compass keeps pointing west, and with Home Fen now exactly where it should have been all along, we're, for once, actually heading in the right direction. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.